In the meanwhile, I'll just begin. So, good evening, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us for our special keynote address by Professor Avishek Parui. This session will be chaired by Professor Simi Malhotra, Head Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and my colleague and also a co-organizer of this conference, Sana, who is currently working as a PhD scholar at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. She was also a Ministry of Education Spark Fellow at Heidelberg University, Germany in 2022. The rapporteur for this session is Samia Rumi, also PhD scholar at the department, and this talk will be followed by a question and answers round. So please post your questions in the chat box. It will be addressed to Professor Parui at the end of his talk. I would now like to hand over the virtual mic to Sana. Sana, please introduce our respected speaker.
Thank you so much, Soumya. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce the final keynote speaker for our conference, Professor Avishek Parui. Professor Parui pursued his PhD from Durham University. He is an associate professor in English at IIT Madras, and he's also the faculty coordinator at the Center for Memory Studies, IIT Madras. And he's also the founding chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies. Professor Parui is the author of Postmodern Literatures, published by Orient Black Swan in 2018. And he's also the author of Culture and the Literary, Matter, Metaphor, Memory, a product of Roman and Littlefield, 2022. Professor Parui is also a published writer of short fiction. Professor Parui's talk for today is titled Remembering, Forgetting, Forgiving, Perspectives from Trauma and Memory Studies. The keynote session will be followed by a brief question and answer session. And this session is also being recorded at the same time as being live streamed on YouTube for our audience and subscribers. Thank you and welcome, Professor Parui. We're really looking forward to your talk. Over to you, Professor Parui.
Well, thank you very much, Sana, for the very kind and generous introduction. I'm very grateful to Professor Malhotra for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to work with Jamia Millia. This is our second engagement. We had this wonderful workshop 2 years ago on memory studies, which attracted some of the finest scholars across the world, really. And I must congratulate the organizers of this conference for putting up such a magnificent theme. And many of the scholars from our institute, IIT Madras, for instance, Revati Krishnan, I think, presented a paper a couple of days ago. So congratulations on the stellar success of this conference. So my title is a little bit deceptive, actually, because I talk about memory, trauma, forgiving. But what I will actually talk about is the unforgiving quality, the whole idea of the unforgivable quality. And what I'm interested in, and I'm looking for the discussion at the end of the session as well, is the ontology of unforgivability, right? So what is the unforgivable? And, especially when it comes to trauma, when it comes to non-remembering. So I will sort of have three big strands in the session. One is what I call the anthropological philosophy or philosophical anthropology of Paul Ricoeur, where he talks about memory, history, forgetting, with an epilogue specifically on forgetting. Then I will very briefly detour into the neuroscience of forgiving, the psychological research on forgiving, what happens in the brain when a subject forgives, what are the neuroanatomical structures and changes which take place. And lastly, I will end with the unique relevance of fiction in understanding this entanglement of memory, trauma, and forgiving in relation to the unforgivability. And the writer that I'm going to choose, which is connected to the concept of this conference, is Sadat Hassan Manto. I will look at the episodic quality, the open-ended liminality in Manto's fiction as a very potent site, really, to understand the ontology of unforgivability, right? What is the unforgivable, the aporetic quality, as it were. So these are three big strands that I will aim to engage with. So I'll start with the philosophical anthropology of Paul Ricoeur. Interestingly, it has also been described as the anthropology of the suffering subject. So how do you have an anthropological philosophical understanding of suffering? And Paul Ricoeur, obviously very famous for his monumental work, which is Memory, History, and Forgetting. In the epilogue of that book, Memory, History, Forgetting, he talks about forgiving. And there's a very interesting and quite provocative idea of forgiving that he talks about. I will just mention a few key strands, and then we can unpack those further. So one thing he mentions at the beginning of that epilogue when he talks about forgiving is the unforgivable is also applied to the most intimate link, uniting the agent and the action, the guilty person and the crime. So it's a bit like what we do in memory studies. We have this running joke, I think Professor Malhotra will also agree, that we could easily rename memory studies into forgetting studies. It'll just make as much sense, perhaps it'll make more sense. Because what we do in memory studies is a very deconstructive take where we undercut the dualism of remembering and forgetting. Rather, we're looking at remembering and forgetting as connected categories. They're ontologically connected, cognitively connected, etc. So likewise, when we talk about forgiving or forgivability, it's actually quite similar and quite synchronous in many ways to unforgivability. In fact, interestingly, Ricoeur mentions Derrida in this particular epilogue. He quotes Derrida, and he says, forgiveness is addressed to the unforgivable. There is only forgiveness where there is something unforgivable, right? So the very ontology of forgiveness, of forgivability, is ironically reliant on unforgivability. There has to be something unforgivable for forgiving to happen in the first place, right? So again, what I'm trying to do at the very outset of this session is taking a sort of deconstructive view. Of course, I brought Derrida, so here we have deconstruction right away. But even philosophically, I'm trying to look at forgiving, memory, remembering as also connected to their supposed ontological opposites, forgiving as connected to unforgivability, remembering as connected to sort of not remembering, representation as connected to non-representation. This is why I'll bring in Manto in the end, when I talk about how a large part of Manto's representational aesthetics is actually an articulation of the non-representable, right? That which cannot be represented, that which cannot be articulated, the operatic quality, the sound, the shriek, the scream of the sort of the hurting body, as it were, the corporeality of suffering. How does it give an articulation to it in terms of articulating the inarticulable, the saying the unsayable, as it were? So the primary stem in this particular session, the primary philosophical epistemic stem, would be the deconstructive stem, the sort of the Derridian deconstructive stem, which does away with the dualisms of suffering and insuffering, forgiving and unforgiving. Now, interestingly, so, what Ricoeur says at that epilogue is that there has to be something unforgivable in the first place for forgiving to take place. So the entire ontology of forgiving is reliant on the sort of the spectral presence of unforgivability, as it were. It has to be there as a spectral residual presence, something unforgivable. Now, interestingly, there's a conversation between Ricoeur and Sorin Antohi, and that can be found in a journal called Janus Head. So there's just a dialogue between Ricoeur and Sorin Antohi, which is sort of on this particular epilogue, as it were, where Ricoeur talks about the non-equivalence of forgiving and justice, and forgiving and more interestingly with amnesty, right? He says that justice is a relation of equivalence. So the debts are settled, the bookkeeping is done, justice is meted out, something mathematical about justice, whereas forgiveness rests on a relation of excess and or overabundance. There's something primarily unquantifiable about forgiving, right? There's something primarily non-metrics about forgiving. It cannot be sort of put into a metrics, whereas justice can have a logbook, justice can have a bookkeeping procedure. So if you meted out justice, is done and dusted. The balance book is maintained, etc. Whereas forgiving is something just, it operates on an ontology of excess, on overabundance. Now, in that very conversation, Ricoeur talks about the tension between amnesty and forgetting, right? He actually talks about how amnesty is caricatured forgetting, right? It's not really forgetting. It doesn't really settle anything. There's a caricature of forgetting. So amnesty is organized forgetting. Obviously, we know amnesty has political significance. There is politics of amnesty. So countries apologizing to each other, communities apologizing to each other for the misdeeds done, etc. But Ricoeur's take on amnesty is interesting. He says amnesty is organized forgetting, and it has nothing to do with the pacification that forgiveness can bring between two consciences. So it is just a superficial optics act, amnesty. And what is also interesting, he talks about how the word amnesty and the word amnesia, they have the same root in French. So it is not an accident. It is a semantic kinship, as it were, between amnesty and amnesia. So you're supposed to forget what has happened. Again, it's like a settling thing. You forget the wrongs and you draw a line to it. It has a closure quality to it. Whereas the whole ontology of forgiving, it has non-closure to it. And this is why I bring in the fiction of Manto in the end, in the South Asian context of partition. So amnesty prevents both forgiveness and justice. So as you can see, the Rico is not a fan of amnesty. And whereas he says that oblivion is not really, or forgetting or erasure of what has happened is not really the whole point of forgiving. Rather, forgiving is something associated with appeased memory, the appeasement of memory. It's not just an erasure of memory, it's an appeasement of memory, as it were. Now, in that very conversation, Rico and Antohi, he mentions this interesting book called Probing the Limits of Representation. And again, I'm going to use this to come to Manto, the limits of representation, especially when it comes to the anthropology of the suffering subject, as it were. And the whole point of that book is to sort of look at the capacity of the narrative to make traumas visible and readable. So how do you sort of achieve the readability of trauma? How do you achieve the visibility of trauma? How do you make trauma visible, readable? Because, at the end of the day, the very ontology of trauma is that it is non-narrative in quality. And here I'm looking at, let's say, someone like Pierre Janet, contemporary of Freud, who came up with this term, traumatic memory and narrative memory. And in fact, the entire ontology of traumatic memory is that it's non-narrative in quality. The very idea of trauma is that you can't talk about it. And only when it becomes narrative memory, and there has to be a temporal gap between the moment of traumatic memory and the moment of narrative memory. So we know when you look at sort of case studies of abuse, case studies of suffering, that a large part of the coping mechanism is non-narrative. You don't want to talk about it, right? You don't want to give a narrative to it, right? So it's not just, narrative should not be seen. I mean, it's a very seductive thing to see narrative as the quick solution. It achieves catharsis, it achieves a closure, so the subject can move on, etc. But actually, it's more complex than that, right? So non-narrative can also be a healing strategy. Not talking about it can also be healing strategies, right? So Janet, who historically coined the term traumatic memory and narrative memory, he makes a very clear distinction between traumatic memory not being narrative in quality, so a non-narrative quality. And what I'll do in the subsequent sections of this keynote is to sort of see how Manto achieves this almost impossible liminal space between narrative memory and traumatic memory, right? So the genius of Manto, I think, will still come to terms with his literary genius. I don't think he has received his critical credit, the kind of writer that he was, and especially the kind of topics he was writing in, and the representational aesthetics or anti-aesthetics that he achieves in his short story is something that we are still coming to terms with in terms of scholarship. I personally think Manto scholarship needs a long way to go to really calibrate with the genius of the writer. But in this particular conversation, when Rico talks about the limits of representation, he clearly mentions the narrative, that special kind of narrative strategy which can make traumas visible and readable. So I begin my session with the anthropology of suffering, the philosophical anthropology of suffering when it comes to trauma, when it comes to oblivion, when it comes to sort of forgetting and memory. Of course, I mean, Rico has written extensively on memory, history, and forgetting, and forgiving is almost an afterthought. It's a small epilogue at the end of the book, really. Most of the book is about the idea of memory, history, and forgetting. And again, like other anthropologists such as Mark Ogg, he looks at the connection between oblivion and remembering, and he doesn't look at it as oppositional categories, but as connected categories. I'll mention Mark Ogg at the end. But let me just move on to the second bit of my keynote, which is about the neuroscience of forgiving, the psychological research which we have today on the sort of the neuroanatomical changes in the brain which happens in forgiving. I'm not going to go into details too much because I'm not an expert to it. I have just an amateurish understanding of neuroscience. But what we do know from the psychological research on forgiving is that a neural function of forgiving is distributed across different brain regions associated with empathetic response and cognitive control. So even in neuroscience, we have a very interesting relationship between forgiving and empathy, as it were, right? And also cognitive control. Now, I'll just mention two interesting figures really working on this interdisciplinary intersection between neuroscience and phenomenology. The first is Michael McCullough. So Michael McCullough has got a really interesting book called The Evolution of the Forgiveness Instinct. And the other book that I recommend very easily is The Kindness of Strangers. He talks about the randomness of kindness, the kindness of strangers. So I do recommend Michael McCullough's book very heavily. But just to connect to the things that we're talking about at the moment, even in neuroscience, even in the scientific study, the quote-unquote scientific study, I mean, I work in IIT, so I'm very fond of flagging up empirical things as if that makes things more credible. We all know that empirical research and credibility have got very blurry and problematic connections, but it works at a very cheap level. So I keep doing these cheap things. But even in the empirical psychological understanding of forgiveness, as we can see from the works of Michael McCullough, even the science of forgiving, the neuroscience of forgiving, makes a very clear distinction, as it were, between forgiveness, condonation, and reconciliation. So even the science is saying that forgiveness and reconciliation are different things. They have different anatomical structures, there are different neural structures, or different functional structures. So we can see how, interestingly, when you go back to Ricoeur now, and Ricoeur's complete dismissal of amnesty, as it were, as a very insufficient caricature of forgiving, you find that even from the sciences, we have a validation of it. So even at a very neural molecular level, the idea of forgiving and the idea of reconciliation are very different, right? Neuroanatomically, they operate in very different ways. So we can see how there's a very interesting dialogue, as it were, between philosophical anthropology and phenomenological neuroscience, where both are saying that forgiving and reconciliation are different. In fact, I will talk a little bit about the whole idea of irreconciliation, the idea of not forgiving, the idea of this liminal territory between remembering and forgetting, between conciliation and reconciliation, and how at the end of the day, we go to fiction for perhaps the most complex understanding of this mental substrates, of the psychological substrates, which also connects to obviously the broader cultural situation, the broader anthropological cultural situation. The other person that I will mention very quickly before I move on to Monto is Glenn Pettygrove. Now, Glenn Pettygrove has this very interesting idea, again, not looking at forgiveness. I mean, he actually has a more radical idea. He says, in this very interesting essay, I'm happy to email it to people who are interested to read it, but Pettygrove's idea of forgiving mentions quite clearly that forgiving has sometimes very little to do with understanding. Now, forget about reconciliation, right? Even understanding and forgiving should not be seen as equivalents of each other. So it is a sort of false assumption, as it were, or a flawed assumption, as it were, to sort of just assume that the forgiving subject has understood the pain, has understood the suffering, has moved on and hence understood and hence forgiven, right? So that is a false equivalence, as it were. So we can see how even phenomenology, neuroscience, in connection to anthropology and philosophy, they sort of come to the same conclusion about forgiving, that it is a very complex cognitive, mental, emotional, experiential state. And it has very complex connections with remembering and forgiving and forgetting, right? So A, the assumption that the forgiving subject has understood the pain is a wrong assumption. B, the forgiving subject has achieved reconciliation is a wrong assumption. C, the forgiving subject has achieved amnesty and hence justice is a wrong assumption. So there is no equivalent relationship between forgiveness and justice, between forgiveness and reconciliation, and forgiveness and understanding, right? So these connections are very, very tenuous connections at best. So as you can see, I've spent the first part of my session problematizing forgiving, right? The whole idea of looking at forgiving as a very problematic category. It is cognitively problematic, experientially problematic. And of course, this will sort of help us go into Manto, because the whole idea of Manto's fiction and the way I look at Manto's fiction is the politics of problematizing, different cognitive categories, remembering and forgetting, forgiveness and unforgiving, consolation and reconciliation, etc. So Manto's short fiction is very liminal territory between this assumed oppositional ontological states, right? So what I have tried to sort of get at the beginning of the session, looking at Paul Ricoeur, Michael McCullough, and Glenn Pettygrove, is to look at the triangulation between remembering, forgetting, and forgiving as a very complex triangulation, right? The assumption that forgiving can only happen when you forget about the trauma is a wrong assumption. In fact, Ricoeur makes it very clear that forgiving and forgetting are not connected to each other at all. I mean, in fact, he talks about forgiving as the sort of the appeased memory, the memory which is appeased, but it was still there, the memory which doesn't go away, but it's still there, right? So hence this problem with the whole idea of amnesty. Now, let me now come to the last bit, or the main bit of my session, which is looking at how this triangulation or the entanglement between remembering, forgetting, and forgiving take place in a fiction about a very complex geopolitical situation in South Asia, which is obviously the partition, because Manto's fiction is about the partition. Just to give you a few numbers again at the beginning, just to validate my session as it were, because when you look at the partition, numbers are important. I mean, we sometimes tend to look at partition from a very experiential, emotional point of view, which of course we should, but the numbers are staggering if you look at the numbers of partition. So just the official estimates, 16 million people, 16 million people were forced to flee their homes in less than 9 months in partition. And 2 million people, again, by official estimates, were killed in the process. So 16 million were forced to leave in less than 9 months, and 2 million were killed in the process. So we can that gives us some idea about the tragedy of partition, the grotesque quality of partition. And it was like an amputation. And many people have looked at partition as an act of sort of amputation, as it were, as an act of abrupt amputation, violence at the epistemic level, corporeal level, etc. Now, where does Manto's fiction come in when you look at, now that I've spent some time looking at the relationship between forgiving and irreconciliation, forgiving and non-understanding, and forgiving and non-forgetting. Now that I've talked about these triangulated categories, where does and how does one situate Manto's fiction in this? Now, there are 3 qualities in Manto's fiction that I would like to highlight at the very beginning, and I will talk a little bit more about that, and I'll choose 4 short stories as case studies in terms of how these qualities are dramatized in Manto's fiction. One is the minimalism in Manto's fiction, the minimalistic quality of the narrative. Second is the liminality that Manto achieves in his fiction. And third is the apparatic quality, right? The sort of the production of aporia, as it were, right? The production of the unpassable, those situations, those mental, cognitive conditions which cannot be passed. And how does Manto achieve it in his depiction of the partition, which, was such a huge tragedy in such a monumental scale? Now, so minimalism, liminality, and the apparatic quality. Now, in connection to these 3 qualities that I've underlined, foregrounded about Manto, what I argue is that Manto achieves a very strange and uncanny cognitive flatness in his fiction. Now, you'll notice there's a cognitive flatness in Manto's fiction. So, there's almost a detached quality where it talks about the mutilated bodies, the way it talks about people getting killed suddenly, the sudden accidents, the banality of evil, the dailiness of evil. There seems to be an almost perverse detachment or an empathy-lessness, as it were, in the narrative quality. It's just like you're walking with a hand camera and basically showing whatever is happening without getting attached to it. Now, there's empathy-lessness that Manto achieves. And again, notice I'm using the word achieve with empathy-lessness, right? He's achieving this empathy-lessness through this process of narrative austerity. That is the other bit that I want to talk about. Narrative austerity. There's no excess in Manto's narrative, so hence it's minimalistic, right? He achieves the liminality with austerity. Now, I think without trying to sound too much like a fanboy, what I'm trying to say is, when you talk about liminality in fiction, the obvious people to go to are James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and Eliot, big modernists, high modernism, etc. But you find that in those kinds of representations, liminality, whether it's the epiphany of modernism, whether it's the interiority of modernism, there's always a sense of narrative excess. There's a lot of description, there's a lot of interiority, there's a lot of semantic, dense semantic process. Whereas Manto achieves the whole idea of liminality, the whole experience of liminality through narrative austerity. And that, I think, is the greatest genius of Manto, the narrative austerity of Manto, right? The minimalism of Manto, as it were, through which he achieves liminality. Because when you talk about liminality, we tend to assume that as a narrative excess, a narrative abundance, whereas for Manto, it's just the opposite. Now, while looking at Manto, there are many theories one can bring in, But in one of the two figures that I find interesting, three actually, I'll talk about Mark Hogg right in the end. But at the moment, let's talk about the psychology in Manto's fiction and the cognitive flatness. I talked about the cognitive flatness, the cognitive detachment, as it were. So one trauma theorist I find very useful while looking at Manto's stories, and I've used this connection in my book as well, is Catherine Malabou. Now, Malabou obviously has written many wonderful works, phenomenal, monumental works on trauma. But the two books that I'm thinking of right now are The Ontology of the Accident and The New Wounded, where she has this very Derridian post-structuralist take on trauma, as it were. And I find it very useful to come to Manto. In fact, in The New Wounded, Malabou talks about how the wound, the experience of the ontology of the wound can cause a metamorphosis, destroying individual history. So wound obviously has a temporal quality. It deterritorializes time. Again, you can see how I'm sort of mixing space and time, as it were. The deterritorialization of time, the defamiliarization of time that happens through trauma, through the wound, the idea of the wound that grows in you. And again, I use this theoretical apparatus of Malabou to understand or engage with what I call the aporetic quality in Manto's fiction, the production of aporia, those moments of impassibility, right? This moment of irreconcilability, the moments of unforgivability. Because as you can see at the very beginning, I talked about how the whole idea of forgiving must have something unforgivable about it in the first place, right? So there is this constant tension, the constant interplay between forgiving and non-forgiving in Manto's fiction, which he achieves through narrative austerity. Now, as I mentioned, that there is obviously, if you read Manto's works, all his sort of famous short stories, and I'm going to talk about a few over here as well, there's obviously this episodic existential intensity that Manto achieves, whether it's the open-endedness at the end of the story, whether it's the cognitive suddenness through which an accident is represented, a trauma is represented, etc. But throughout the narrative design that Manto has, the dominant narrative feature that he achieves is a detached journalistic vocabulary. And I look at his detachment as a very interesting narrative strategy. It's almost like a narrator is detached. He's just walking around a dying city, walking around necropolis, as it were, and just detached in a very cognitive way, but just representing and showing what is happening, right? This cognitive detachment, obviously it translates into cognitive flatness in Manto's fiction. There's a very sort of clear journalistic quality that Manto has in his fiction. He's just reporting what is going on, as it were, without getting involved, without getting engaged. And that detachment, I think, is part of the narrative genius of Manto. What we also see throughout Manto's fiction, especially if you read a story like Koldo, for instance, or Open It, where emotional responses to the subject dwindle into muscle memory of repeated suffering, right? So there's no emotional response left. So, I mean, Koldo, as you know, is a story of a woman, a female subject who was repeatedly raped, and then a character called Sakina, and it's about her father, Sirajuddin, who's looking at the different camps, the refugee camps, trying to locate the daughter. And of course, the story, a very short story, really. I mean, Manto's story is a very short. I think perhaps the longest story he has is Toba Tek Singh, which I'll talk about in a minute. But Koldo, Mistake, Cold Meat, Thanda Ghost, very, very short story about one slice of an episodic intensity, narrated with narrative austerity, as it were. But in this story, Koldo, the female subject Sakina, who was repeatedly raped and who was found in a refugee camp, finally the father discovers her, and there's a scene in the end where I'm sure everyone's read it over here, where the doctor is instructing the father to open the window, saying Koldo. And listening to it, the female subject begins undressing. It's almost like a dead body getting reactivated in a very, very perverse way. But what is interesting about the story is what, I'm going to bring in Antonio Damasio here a little bit as well, because how the autobiographical self, the emotional self, has disappeared completely. And what we have is a motor self, the muscle self, where every action is just a muscle memory, the muscle memory of suffering, right? The muscle memory of pain. And that is the only self left, right? The muscle self. Now, Damasio has this very interesting book. I mean, I mentioned Damasio a lot because I think it's one of those really interesting psychologists / neuroscientists who worked extensively on emotion and cognition while drawing on philosophy. He's written on Spinoza, he's written on Descartes, etc. But this particular book is called The Feeling of What Happens, right? Where, as you can see, he's taking a phenomenological take on cognition, a phenomenological take on brain, etc. Now, in this particular book, he talks about trauma victims. And I'm going to use this to sort of look at what happens in Koldo, as it were, where Damasio talks about how the transient impoverishment of the autobiographical self. The autobiographical self is impoverished, is done away with, is dead, so to speak, right? And all you have is a muscle self, the core flesh, which is responding to a muscle, like a signal, as it were. So Koldo, by Sadat Hassan Manto, is a very disturbing and moving example, I should say, of this complete erasure of the autobiographical self and the only existence of the core muscle motor cell, which is responding to an instruction again and again. So Koldo. So that becomes quite, literally a theater of suffering, a corporeal theater of suffering that Manto achieves in just 1.5 pages, really. Right. Now, when it comes to cold meat, which is called Thanda Gosht, it is about, again, a very interesting study of the necropolitics that Manto is depicting in the sort of the context of partition. Again, is about the violence on the female body, and we can see how this constant reference of the violated female body, the violated female subject, becomes very symbolic of the sort of the landscape of suffering, the cartographic violence that has been done. The sort of the tearing away of the map, the creation of new borders, the re-territorialization, which obviously Toba takes and talks about, with which I'll end. But there's constant interplay of the cartographic re-territorialization and the violation of the female body. So there's this corporeal cartographic entanglement happening all the time in Manto's fiction. Now, when it comes to cold meat, again, it is about a man who's coming back home to his wife after having violated a female subject. Now, the only difference over here is he has become cold meat because he has realized that a female subject he was about to violate is already dead, right? So it became quite literally, a necrophilic encounter, as it were. So it has a character of Ishwar Singh who comes back to Kulwant Kaur. Kulwant Kaur is his wife, or companion, we don't quite know, but someone he's supposed to be loyal with. And we get to know that he cannot carry out the sexual act because he's just come back from a moment of trauma. Now, interestingly, the trauma in this particular story, and I write about this in my book as well, is what could be classified as perpetrator trauma, right? Not the sufferer trauma. Because what happens in the story is that a perpetrator of trauma, he comes back traumatized because he can't carry out his normal sexual metabolic acts anymore, right? And interestingly, when his wife/companion, who sort of kills him in the end with a dagger, asks him, "Who have you been with and where have you been?" He answers, "I've been nowhere and I've been with nobody," which ironically becomes quite true because he literally was about to consume a nobody, a dead woman, as it were, right? So again, the nobody becomes the pure corporeality in a very perverse sense, the fleshy corporeality of the dead subject. Again, we can go back to the Damasio understanding of the erasure of the autobiographical self, the woman without a name, right? Just a female body, a nobody who's already dead. So it becomes quite literally something like the Freudian uncanny, unheimlich, as it were, something outside the home, right? Something which is sort of outside the life, outside the known parameter. So obviously, and what this story also tells us, and I'll use this to come to the next story I have in mind, which is Mistake, which is about the randomness as well as the banality of terror, right? The whole idea of how terror becomes so normalized in a very neural way, right? It's almost like a neural normalization, like a cognitive orientation towards terror. It's something you expect all the time. It's something which is happening all the time in such a banal way that you don't see that as something outside anymore. So Mistake, of course, is perhaps the shortest short story of Manto, which is about a mob fury, a mob violence, a mob about to kill a man and trying to find out, and a man trying to defend himself by saying, "Well, I am one of you," and trying to recite something just to sort of, flag up his identity. So again, and then of course he gets killed, and then he gets undressed, and there's a gaze into his genitalia, and the mob realizes it was a mistake, and it's deliberately misspelled, mistake, M-I-S-H-T-A-K-E, right? And this deliberate misspelling, obviously, is part of the mistake, ironically, ontologically, as well as semantically. It becomes part of the mistake, right? But again, what the story is telling us is a reduction of the human subject into a corporeal marker, into a corporeal sign, as it were. So the human subject is reduced to the body, is reduced to the corporeal quality, right? And that becomes part of the banality of terror, the banality of evil. And Manto achieves a representation of this unrepresentable, as it were, through, again, minimalism and narrative austerity, right? So I mentioned at the beginning, this last section, how I'm looking at three big qualities in Manto's fiction: the minimalism in Manto, the liminality of Manto, and the operatic quality of Manto, right? So mistake is barely a 10-sentence story, I think, right? And he achieves this. And mind you, I mean, I should say this again, not to embarrass myself so much as a fanboy. I mean, I don't read Urdu, right? I mean, just imagine what the stories would be in the original, right? So, I mean, I read English, and that sends me shivers down the spine in terms of what can be achieved through narrative austerity, right? Something which is almost unrepresentable, something which is almost unsayable. And how does Manto achieve this liminality between sayability and unsayability, between remembering and non-remembering, between forgiving and non-forgiving, right? Through this pure field of fiction. I'll conclude now with a reference to perhaps the most famous short story of Manto, which is Toba Tek Singh, which is perhaps the most famous short story about partition, so to speak, right? So Toba Tek Singh is about a chronotop, really. You know, it's about a capsule of space and time which has been erased, which is not cartographically available anymore, right? And you know, it's about the blending of the human body into that lost landscape body. You know, how Bishen Singh, the human subject, becomes Toba Tek Singh, you know, the lost place on the map. And interestingly, and perhaps very appropriately, the story, the site in the story is a lunatic asylum in Lahore. You know, it's about the other men, you know, the men who are the aberrations from normalcy, as it were. And of course, that has a profound symbolic significance in the sense that that we're talking about the sort of madness of partition, the mutilation happening all around. But ironically, the madhouse in Lahore becomes the most sane space because people ask the most foundational questions. You know, why would you go to India? Why would you go to Pakistan? What is India? What is Pakistan? The foundational questions. And of course, the story is a very, very subtle satire on the bureaucracy of partition. I mean, this is a little bit different from the other Manto stories in a way, because it's not really about the brutality of partition. This is about the bureaucracy of partition. How some people suddenly in India and Pakistan decided to send the Hindus and Muslims across the border because that was the bureaucratically correct thing to do. Right. Now, it is more a story about epistemic violence than corporeal violence, the violence on the level of knowledge, right? What happened to my village? What happened to my identity? The erasure of the identities and how it translates into epistemic violence in a very direct corporeal sense. Now, of course, Toba Tek Singh is a story about a person called Bishen Singh, who is about to be sent to India because he is not a Muslim. And that, you know, obviously, it is also a story about agency lesson. No one's asking the madmen where they want to go. They will just be sent over because that is a bureaucratically correct thing to do, right? And of course, the question that he asks to all the people around him, the question that cannot be answered, the unanswerable question, again, we're looking at sort of unforgivability, unanswerability as narrative strategies in Manto, right? That where is Toba Tek Singh? Where is my village? And no one has the answer to it, right? And of course, the story is about his desperate resistance to being transported, his desperate resistance to being taken over from one place to another place. And I'm guessing most of you read the stories. I'm not going to go into details. It has what is psychologically known as a retrograde amnesia, as in he forgets about things which happened many years ago. He just has new memories, just immediate things, but he's forgotten about things which happened many, many years ago. He can't understand, he can't recognize his daughter anymore, he can't recognize his neighbors anymore, etc. And that amnesia in Manto, and I'm using that to come back to Ricord very cheekily, actually, because when Ricord talks about the caricatured forgiveness in amnesia, in amnesty, where Toba Tek Singh is a little bit like an amnesty. The two big states have decided to do the politically correct thing. let's sign an amnesty, let's swap the madmen across the borders. It has an amnesty quality to it. And of course, as Ricoeur says, semantically, amnesty and amnesia are related. We're supposed to forget what happened, right? And among other things, Toba Tek Singh is also a story about the refusal to forget, right? The refusal to forgive, the refusal to forget, and a refusal to sign up on an amnesty, right? The subject doesn't want an amnesty. The human subject doesn't want to be consumed by a collective amnesty of doing the politically correct thing, right? So Toba Tek Singh is a story about a perverse reconciliation, which is actually about irreconciliation. That reconciliation of doing the correct thing of sending madmen across the borders actually exaggerates the trauma rather than healing it. So again, we're back to Ricoeur in saying how amnesty can have exactly the opposite effect of what it politically sets out to do. I'll just conclude with the final image in Toba Tek Singh, where obviously is that very, very symbolic, iconic image of the madman falling in that liminal no man's land between India and Pakistan. The place, and the translation goes, the bit of earth which had no name, right? That is where Toba Tek Singh falls and dies, with his swollen legs. And again, the swelling of the legs, of course, is very symbolic of it is a corporeal condition where, it's sort of, maybe it's water in the legs, it's just passing it in. But also, it may be seen as a very interesting symbolic strategy of holding on to time, right? Not letting go of time. And the swelling of the body, there's something very temporal about that. So again, we're looking at temporality and corporeality as connected categories in Manto's fiction, where the madman with the swollen legs falls in the no man's land, the bit of earth which had no name. Now, I look at this last section, the speciality of the no man's land between India and Pakistan, and how it has some kind of Pyrrhic victory for the madman, the fact that he dies in the no man's land without being transported to India or Pakistan. But in his death, there's some kind of a posthumous victory, as it were, right? That he doesn't get transported, and he sort of makes that land into Toba Tek Singh, as it were. He calls it, he renames it, so it becomes some kind of an anti-erasure, some kind of a reclamation of territories, claiming back the lost land by dying on that particular spot. But also, this can be read in an anthropological, social anthropological way, and I'm sort of bringing in Mark Org's work on Oblivion, where Org talks about the connection between oblivion on non-place. And again, it's a really interesting essay. I do recommend it heavily for those of you who haven't read it, where Org talks about how these liminal spaces like elevators, escalators, railway stations, airports, the spaces which connect to different other spaces and non-space, as it were, those actually become very interesting spaces for strategic transportation, for subject formation, right? And those are spaces which are forgotten. I mean, no one remembers an elevator, no one remembers an escalator, right? But these non-places which are connected to oblivion are actually quite interesting, especially in metropolitan modernity, because metropolitan modernity is so reliant on these non-spaces, right? If you imagine a world, I hope it doesn't happen, that elevators stop working, escalators stop working, or lifts stop working, or airports stop working, or conveyor belts stop working. So all these non-places which are quote unquote invisible in normative conditions, right? They actually carry out very useful, important, symbolic, psychological purposes in terms of transporting things and objects around. So the end of Toba Tek Singh becomes a reclamation, a territorial reclamation, but it's also a corporeal reclamation. And it sort of brings into a very interesting conclusion. I mean, the talk that I'm delivering over here, the triangulation, as it were, between memory, forgiving, and forgetting, right? That triangulation is achieved at a very sort of corporeal, symbolic level in the no man's land, the dead body of the madman, the no man's land, that brings together and dramatizes in foregrounds this constant tension between remembering and unremembering, between forgivability and unforgivability, and between memory and history. The fact that he doesn't choose to get into history, the fact that he doesn't choose to get into the sort of the classified nation state, but rather he chooses to sort of stay and end in a liminal state, which becomes Toba Tek Singh. And the narrative almost grants him that victory, that no space, that no man's land between India and Pakistan, between the two big states, is Toba Tek Singh. So he achieves that posthumously. So just to conclude, I think Manto's fiction, which again, I say, maybe I'm boring you now, deserves more scholarship than it has already received. More psychological scholarship, which brings in neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, of course, fiction studies as well, because it achieves something that is almost impossible, right? The impossibility of trauma, the impossibility of suffering, the unsayability of suffering, right? And how does it achieve it through this triangulated tension between forgiveness, memory, and forgetting, right? And how does it achieve it through fiction, the episodic quality of fiction, the open-ended quality of fiction? And I think the greatest genius that he has, as a writer, is his narrative austerity, the fact that it's so minimalistic and at the same time so liminal in quality. It's not the modernist liminality which relies on dense descriptions of epiphany. I mean, I'm a big fan of Joyce and Woolf, so that's not a problem. But what Manto achieves through minimalism, I think, saying less to achieve more, the psychological complexity and depth that he achieves by saying so less. The narrative austerity of Manto, I think, is part of his narrative and aesthetic genius. So I think I'll just conclude by saying that when you look at partition, the politics of partition, the big grotesque event which took place in South Asia, of course, there are many ways to look at it. But as a student of literature, as a reader of fiction, of course, I keep going to fiction in terms of understanding how historical reality, materiality can be stylized, represented, defamiliarized, and remembered through this very, very focal points, interesting focal affective frameworks, as it were, right? And the affective frameworks of Manto, I think, requires us to revisit psychologically as well as politically the relationship between remembering, forgiving, and forgetting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Parui, for that absolutely scintillating talk. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Absolutely amazing. And of course, Manto remains a legend to all of us as far as the art of narration is concerned. And as you rightly said, the affective response generated is manifold when one reads Manto in the original. I have a really quick remark, only a really quick question before we move on to the questions from the audience. And at the risk of, going back to the global north, your talk reminded me of this particular incident where one Holocaust survivor, namely Eva Moses, she came forward and publicly forgave Dr. Mengele, this German doctor who had carried out various experiments on her and others, and probably her sister as well. So she came and forgave them publicly. So my question to you is, who really in this case holds the agency to forgive? Where does this agency of forgiveness lie?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, for which I have to open my diary one more time because it's such a complex question. So thank you for that. I think if you read, obviously I'm not qualified clinically to respond to your question, but from a phenomenological perspective, where we read the works of, let's say, Glenn Pettygrove, he talks about the three models of forgiveness. So one is a model of debt cancellation. The debt is canceled, so everything is equal. The other is an emotional model. And the third is a volitional model, the agency of the forgiver, right? So I think in this particular case, agency plays a very important role. It's almost like, the subject forgiving the oppressor, it exerts an act of agency. It can be narrative agency, emotional agency, etc. And in this particular case, it's a very public spectacle of forgiving, right? It's not a personal letter written from one subject to another subject. The whole point of this forgiving is the spectacular quality of it. It has to be a public spectacle. It has to be sort of mediated through different kinds of media apparatus. So I think in this particular case, I'm going to use the memory studies model of Andrew Hoskins. This kind of forgiving has an emergent quality to it. It emerges from a subject. It emerges from a site, but it's also connective in quality, right? It must be able to be connective. It must be able to become public news. It must be able to become some kind of a transnational, transmaterial framework through which it must sort of move around through media channels, newspaper channels, print media, digital media, etc. So my quick and perhaps insufficient response to your brilliant question is that this is an example of emergent as well as connective forgiving, right? It is subjective, it is personal, it is autobiographical, but it also relies ontologically on the public spectacle through which it must move around, because it is an act of forgiving which is corporeal quality, like you said. I mean, she was being tested through very, medical methods, perhaps very perverse methods, through this, grotesque things that the Nazis did. But also, she was part of a collective suffering. She was part of a collective demography of suffering, right? So there is an anthropology, and I began my essay, my session by saying, when you look at the anthropology, the suffering subject. So this becomes an example of a suffering subject who is always already part of a collective. So it is emergent and connective in quality.
Perfect. Thank you so much, sir. Maybe we can move on to the question answer session now. Soumya?
Yes, thank you, Sana, and thank you so much, Professor Parui. It was such an engaging talk, and it's always so much fun learning from you. I've actually attended your NPTEL course on trauma and literature, and it sort of initiated me into the field. So, and there also you discuss Manto at length. So thank you so much for that. And you've laid out these dualisms of forgivability, unforgivability, the representable and inarticulable, and then memory, forgetting, narrative, non-narrative, reconciliation, and non-reconciliation. So we really have so much to think about. And my question to you is, do you think the impulse to forgive in some conditions streams from a strain of self-preservation? And what, according to you, are the linkages between the categories of healing and self-preservation, if any, according to you?
I mean, that's such an excellent question, really. I mean, self-preservation. I mean, and I'm thinking of, if you allow me to become a little abstract and philosophical, I'm thinking of Spinoza right away. I mean, Spinoza has this wonderful concept called conatus, C-O-N-A-T-U-S. And I mean, it is very abstract, but in my defense, I would say, but even neuroscientists treat it very seriously today, the idea of conatus. So conatus is that innate drive of the brain or the body to preserve itself, right? So we as primates, we are hardwired to preserve ourselves, right? We are hardwired. The neural toolkit we have in us is for self-preservation. The immediate drive is self-preservation. So conatus is a category that Spinoza had used to sort of use self-preservation. And you're quite right when you say, forgiving is an act of self-preservation, because what forgiving does, and of course, there's a lot of neuroscientific clinical work or neuroscience which says that forgiving can be an act of healing in a mental way. It gets rid of resentment, bitterness, and obviously stress. So, amygdala and other parts of the cortex of the brain get more relaxed when forgiving happens in a very experiential way. But not to get too clinical about it, even if you look at the whole narrative of forgiving, the whole idea of, subject A forgiving subject B, through an act of storytelling, through an act of statement, through an act of narration, right? That itself becomes, in a way, an example of sort of empathy articulation. There's a lot of work on empathy, cognitive stability, and forgiveness, right? So forgiveness, according to most research in sort of neuroscience in a clinical way, helps the subject achieve cognitive stability, right? So it can be still an act of reorientation. You're reorienting yourself back to stability, to cognitive stability through an act of empathy. And it relies on empathy a lot. So the fact that you can imagine yourself as someone else, the fact that you can imagine yourself as the perpetrator, and that allows you to accept the apology of the perpetrator in a way, because you're imagining the suffering of the perpetrator, as it were, because that is what empathy does. So in a very psychological sense, forgiving is associated with empathy articulation, cognitive stabilization. But I think you just hit the nail on the head when you say that it is actually about self-preservation, because that is at the heart of who we are as primates. We are hardwired, neurally hardwired to preserve ourselves, right? But I would take a step further away here and say both forgiving as well as non-forgiving can be instances of self-preservation. Even non-forgiving can be an example of self-preservation in certain categories, right? The choice not to forgive, the decision not to forgive can also be an example of self-preservation. I think I mentioned right at the beginning, using Ricord, who mentions Derrida away, saying that the very idea, the very experience, the very assumption of forgiving, it assumes that something unforgivable was in the first place. So there is an apparated quality in the very essence, the very ontological, foundational framework of forgiving. You're forgiving something because at the first instance, there is something unforgivable about it, which is why you're wrong, which is why there is injustice, which is why there is this sort of epistemic resentment or hurt or wound or whatever the case may be, right? So I think both forgiving as well as non-forgiving can be seen as act of self-preservation, but with forgiving, you connect to empathy and cognitive stabilization. And with non-forgiving, it can be related to different kinds of coping mechanisms as well, in terms of not letting it go, right? Not letting it become part of narrative memory. Again, I'm going back to Pierre Janet, sort of holding on to traumatic memory and letting it dilute as traumatic memory without the easy exit into a narrative memory. So yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. And then the next question is from Farhana, and she asks, in this digital age where there's a constant desire to document or record the quotidian, and with pop-ups of memory every now and then, how, if at all, do you think affects the legitimacy or the dynamics of the triangulation of forgiving, forgetting, remembering?
Yeah, I was hoping not to speak of digitality today, but of course one can't help it. But it's a very, very good question, because I think when we look at this affective sort of instances or affective experiences, whether it's memory or forgiving or forgetting, sentiments run through structures, right? Sentiments run through material apparatus. And of course, the materiality of memory is absolutely important. I mean, how we remember, the mode of memory becomes sometimes more important than the matter of memory. And likewise, I think what this question really probes into in a very, very intelligent and interesting way is looking at the ecology of forgiving, as it were, right? How does forgiving happen? The sort of digital ecology, as it were. The difference between, let's say, forgiving through the writing of a letter, or forgiving through making a Twitter post, or it's called X, I think, at the moment, or forgiving through social media, forgiving through a public statement, right? So I think there are two things at play in a post-digital age. One is the kinetic quality of information, the fact that it is so quick that it can be put up so fast, and it can sort of travel at a viral speed. That's the medical metaphor we use for kinesis. And secondly, of course, the spectacular quality of any information, the fact that subject A can apologize to subject B in a spectacular way, right? So the spectacularity of forgiving and the kinesis of forgiving, these obviously rely on the digital apparatus, right? Now, what it does to the psychology of the forgiven, or the psychology of the forgiver, is a different research to be done, and I'm not qualified to do it. In terms of, not yet. I haven't studied empirically, again, as if that were anything of credibility, but I don't have any research at my disposal which looks at what happens to forgiving, in a post-digital age, sort of calibrating it as against a pre-digital age. So forgiving through a private utterance, or forgiving through a private letter, as opposed to, let's say, an act of forgiving through a public spectacle, sort of public platform. Because I think what is at play over here, I think this is perhaps the only sensible response I have to this question, is the act of forgiving and the act of seeking forgiveness. There's a lot more visibility about it, right? In a post-digital age, there's a lot of visibility around forgiving, right? So it becomes more visible, it becomes more spectacular, more theatrical, etc. So obviously, there's a lot of immediate affective plug points that the pronouncement of forgiving can sort of connect itself to. So, it becomes spectacular, it becomes visible to 100,000, 10,000 followers, or whoever's looking at it, etc. So the visibility becomes a big part of the apparatus of apology and forgiving at the moment, I think. And that, I think, is an important cultural condition, because I am completely without question, in the sense that when you look at the affective qualities of remembering, forgiving, forgetting, etc., we can't be sort of looking at it from an isolated affective parameter without considering the monumental material parameters around it, I think. So I think visibility, kinesis, and the judgmentality becomes more amplified in a post-digital age. So that's completely correct, I think.
Thank you, sir. So the next question is from Devaditya, sir. Can I please unmute him?
Yes, of course, yes.
Yeah, hi. Uh, Thank you, Avishek, but also I think I should apologize for being this repeat questioner after every session and pretty much hogging discussion time. But I was just curious about this relationship between trauma and justice, right? So, and which is a term that in taking recourse to RICA, right? So you seem to gloss over, and I just want to kind of bring the discussion back to that, right? And the relationship between trauma and justice, because I think, I mean, in referring to RICA, and there's something very Anderithian that RICA actually does, right? So by kind of pitting justice against forgiveness, right? So while Derrida would have to say something completely different about it, right? So Derrida would rather say that forgiveness in itself is a moment of justice, right? So because for Derrida, right? So, and he does talk about forgiveness in different contexts. He takes up the text of Merchant of Venice in what is a relevant translation to talk about mercy and therefore justice as forgiveness, right? And for him, therefore, justice is that moment of the incalculable, right? So rather than how Ricker would posit it as a settling of accounts, right? So, or a certain kind of bookkeeping. So therefore, insofar as Ricker does something devious, I think, right? So by pitting one against the other, right? So I am more interested in knowing, right? So whether trauma really has a relationship to justice, right? So given the kind of deconstructive analysis that you are saying you are doing, right? So that's my question. But thank you so much for
Thanks, Deborah. It was great to hear from you again. So I think you're quite right. I mean, there seems to be something very, very rigid and perhaps dogmatic that Ricord has against justice. But my guess is he's probably looking at justice as a strictly political collective category. So if there's a fallacy in Ricord's argument, and I'm willing to sort of agree with you on that, but I think he's looking at justice not as an interpersonal, intersubjective phenomenon, but as justice is something more collective, rigid, and institutionalized, I think. I mean, he does use the word institutionalized a few times in the epilogue as well. So I think that perhaps limits his understanding of justice in a way which makes him sort of oppose it as in sort of terms of using forgiving. Whereas for Derrida, I think he has a more fluid, perhaps a broader definition of justice, which is not strictly speaking institutional equality. It can be interpersonal, it can be intersubjective, it can be intercorporeal as well. I mean, Derrida talks about the corporeality of justice as well. So I think that perhaps is the main difference between these two thinkers, whereas Ricord ends up being perhaps a little bit too consumed by an institutional dogmatic understanding of justice, which is about stamp papers and bureaucracy and paperwork, rather than looking at justice possibly as a more personal, subjective, experiential category, which is what Derrida does. So I think that perhaps is a difference. I mean, what do you think? I mean, I'm curious to know. Hello?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, what Ricker is perhaps doing is also trying to kind of bureaucratize the very idea of justice and perhaps looking at the justiciable part of justice rather than consider justice as a concept, right? So and that's where I think the Anderithian part of the Ricker perhaps comes through, right? So and of course, I mean, what Derrida would say that there's something very, very different about justice insofar as it is not law, right? So that it is not reducible to legality.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you, but I find Ricord useful in a certain sense because one also needs to problematize the relationship between forgiving and justice. And I think, I mean, as dogmatic as Ricord is, and as institutional and bureaucratic the Ricord is, it is perhaps helpful to also problematize the easy equivalence between justice and forgiving. So even if it's a fallacy of Ricord, and I'm willing to sort of agree it's a fallacy, because he does look at justice purely as an institutional stamp-carrying category. But what that enables us to do epistemically, I think, is perhaps problematize the easy equivalence between justice and forgiving, which I think is useful at some level. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you
so much. Thank you so much, Professor Parui, for engaging with our questions. And there are still a lot of questions in the chat box. And I would like to apologize to the people who have sent us the questions because of the lack of time, we will not be able to address it.
I'm very happy to be emailed, by the way. Very happy to be emailed with questions. I'll do my best to get back. Yeah.
Yes, sir. I will email it to you. Thank you. So I would like to thank Professor Parui for that intellectually stimulating speech and for so generously answering all the questions in such great detail, and also for taking out the time from his busy schedule to deliver this keynote address while he is in a completely different time zone. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you also to all the chairs and moderators. The chairs for this session are Professor Simi Malhotra and Sana, and the rapporteur is Samia Rumi, and all the participants who have joined us from different time zones. I would now like to request Farhana to deliver the closing address.
Thank you so much, sir, once again, for this very, very academically enriching talk. And with that, we have come to the end of the third Young Researchers Conference titled Trauma and Memory Studies, Responses from the Global South. This conference has been a 3 days long affair and with a total of 13 sessions. We have had 6 very enthralling and compelling keynote addresses. For day 1, we had Professor Lakhurst with us and Professor Krabs. For day 2, we had Professor Michaela Borzaga and Professor Sam Durand. And for the third and final day, we had with us Professor Nadia Bhatt and as we can all see, Professor Avishek Parui with us. And besides the keynote sessions, we have had very engaging 7 paper presentation sessions, including a total of 20 presentations. And these sessions were titled as Anthropogenic Catastrophes, Specters of Trauma and Memory, Displaced Voices, Ritual Performances and Memorialization in Exile, Transnational Trajectories, Cataclysmic Hauntings and Mnemonic Complexity in War Narratives, Frames in Flux, Whirling Memories and Cinematic Tales of Trauma, Speciality and Suffering, Testimonial Imprints from Urbanscapes, Disenfranchised Discourses, Resurgence of Feminist Accounts, and finally, Ink, Insight and Impact, Unveiling Resilience in Contemporary Life Writings. With that, I would quickly end the closing address and hand it over to Sana for the final vote of thanks. But before I do that, I would kindly invite our head, Professor Simi Malhotra, who has been the pillar of this conference, continuously motivating us, encouraging us. And as I've already mentioned, ma'am, without you, this wouldn't have been possible. So over to you, ma'am.
No. I mean, this is really my chance to thank all 4 of you. I mean, of course, we're very, very grateful to Professor Parui for taking our time and being with us on a Sunday. I know a lot of people have been pulled out on Saturday and Sunday, but we're very grateful to all the keynote speakers. I think these keynote speeches were very, very important for the conversation to go on right from day 1 till day 3. And of course, through the sessions in which we've had absolutely, absolutely fantastic papers. I've been overwhelmed hearing some of the papers that we've had in this conference, and I think the fact that we've had such huge attendance all through the 3 days, and people have been wanting to listen to the paper presenters is really a testimony to the excellence that we've seen in the kind of papers which have been presented in this conference. And of course, the keynote speeches were very, very important. These are extremely important voices, and I think they talk to us, not just to the current question, but beyond this particular conference to our engagements in literature and culture in any case. So these are this has been a very, very important conference. And we're really grateful to all the people who came out to chair, all the people who came out to report, and of course, all the people who've been attending the conference. We're very grateful to the presenters, and to all the interlocutors. I think those questions have been so important for not just for the individual speakers, but also for all of us to think with and think through. And so, of course, whether it was Dr. Devaditya's interventions or all the other interventions that we've had, including, of course, by Sana, Farhana, Sango, and by Soumya themselves. But really, I want to say that we will certainly be publishing, like the other conferences, the proceedings of this conference as a book. And as the conference has gone on, I've already got interest being given by a couple of publishers already. So I'm pretty sure there'll be lots of people who will be looking forward to these volumes. But really, I'm really grateful. But I must doff my hat off to the 4 stars of this conference. That is Sana and Soumya and Farhana and Sango. I mean, what a stupendous job you guys have done. I mean, I really watch you and learn so much from all 4 of you. I mean, absolutely fantastic, right from the conception of the CFP to the choice of papers that you've made. I mean, just the titles of the sessions. I mean, absolutely amazing, and of course the keynote speakers and the absolutely perfect execution of all the sessions, including the YouTube lives and the recordings and everything. So I mean, this has been such a joy for me to watch, and I really doff my hats off to the 4 of you. I think now we can probably professionalize YRCs. I think you guys have, from the first time to the second to the third, have really shown how to ace it. And really, I mean, I'm absolutely grateful to all 4 of you, and I give all my love to you guys and all my admiration. So thank you so much, and of course, thanks to Professor Parui and to all the people who are here. You've stayed with us for all these 3 days, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this YRC. Absolutely great fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. You're too sweet. Now, I would like to, on the behalf of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and the organizing committee, I would like to thank everyone who's helped make this conference a success. I extend my gratitude to all the keynote speakers, Professor Lakhas, Professor Krabs, Professor Durant, Professor Bozaga, Professor Butt, and of course, Professor Parui, for making space for us from their busy schedule and managing to give us time despite, the time differences. Sir joins us from Durham right now. So I would also like to thank all the paper presenters for their diverse and enriching sessions. And thank you to all the young scholars who chaired and moderated our various sessions, and all the rapporteurs who helped us make the event, run the event so smoothly. And of course, a huge thanks to the people who turned in to listen to us, again, from different time zones across the world. And a heartfelt gratitude to Professor Simi Malhotra, who orchestrated the whole event and whose meticulous work ethic makes us work harder and better every day. She'll testify to that. Thank you so much, ma'am. And with this, I'm happy to announce the conclusion to this 3-day event. And I hope to see all of you soon in a similar setting.
Before we log out, can we all please have a picture? If they could just turn
the
on.
chairs and rapporteurs and moderators are here, and they can, turn on their cameras. We'll take a quick screenshot.
Yeah, the paper presenters as well.
There's no bar on others switching on either. I mean, anybody can switch on.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.